This is The Crossover.
Now, very pleased to be joined by the first and only Executive Director of the National Basketball Social Justice Coalition. This is a long title. James Cadogan. James, good morning. Thanks for joining me.
Good morning, Howard. Thanks for having me on. Great to be with you.
Great to be with you. So you and I are getting together here right on the heels of, the listeners will hear this a little later than we are actually recording this, but we're on the heels of the player wildcat strike in Orlando in the bubble last year, which spawned a lot of discussion and spawned some initiatives, including this social justice coalition. Your job and that coalition that you are heading is a direct result of that. But I want to start with just kind of the mission itself, because this is still very new to people. It's certainly going to be something that listeners, NBA fans, I think they're aware of it, but it's still in its relative infancy. You've been on board since just in May. It's been just a few months. I'm going to read the description the NBA sent out at the time, but then give me the layman's version of this. So the way the league described it when they brought you on was that the coalition will lead the NBA family's collaborative efforts to address racial inequality and advance social justice by raising awareness, educating, and advocating for meaningful policy change in several areas, including voting access and criminal justice system reform at the national, state, and local level. Again, a mouthful. So give me the layman's version of that. You've had a few months to kind of get acclimated and get a sense of really what this coalition is capable of doing. So how would you describe it when the question comes up? What's the job?
Yeah, the job for me is to be the NBA community's lobbyist for social justice issues. And so to be able to take our incredible platform and brand of this league and community and build off the players' advocacy, whether it's individual or collective, team and governor and leadership investment in advocacy after last year, to take that and move it into the public policy space. So the way I like to frame it is we're turning people power into public policy. And I think the key to understanding the differential, because the NBA has had a lot of investment over time in community engagement through NBA Cares. We've got our NBA Foundation now, as well as the various team side foundations. But the piece of the puzzle that the coalition addresses is, how do we get involved in the political space? And how do we make sure that we are engaged in the legislative battles that are usually where most of our social justice initiatives end? So we want to be in that space and make sure that the NBA community's voices, our players' voices, our governors, our teams, and our leadership are represented at those tables, and that on our issues, criminal justice, voting rights, and policing to start with, that our values are reflected in that legislative process.
And when you say our values, that is the NBA, as the press release stated, NBA family writ large, right? That's the players' union in concert with the league. So that's also 30 franchise owners and the league office. That's everybody. That, I mean, on these particular issues that you're raising, or the league has raised, I don't know that there's unanimity. There seems to be some consensus about the importance of these issues, especially in a league that is 75 to 80% black players at any given time. But obviously, there's not necessarily political unanimity across 30 teams. And by the way, it's not even just 30 owners. Those are ownership groups. So in most cases, it's multiple people who have massive stakes in this league. So on some level, I would think your job and the job of lobbying on what you describe as our priorities as a league, it seems like it might be a little bit more complicated than that, because I don't know how you get to that definition of consensus first before deciding, okay, I, as James Cadogan, walking the halls of Congress, I assume you're literally walking the halls of Congress at times?
Yeah, now that we're back, I am, yeah.
And you're representing those interests. Uh-huh. Is it more complex than it would seem at first glance?
100%. Anytime you get a group of people that large together, and you get an organization as complex as the NBA together with exactly what you said, we've got 450 players, we've got 30 franchises, we've got ownership groups, we've got our league leadership, we've got our union leadership. That's just a lot of fingers in any pie, right? And so the job for me to get to that point of representing our interest in being able to say, hey, we support the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which we do, or hey, we support the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which we did, or here's how we think about sentencing reform. To get to those places, it takes a lot of dialogue and a lot of internal conversation to drive to that point of consensus, because there's never going to be a point of unanimity on everything that we believe. And the goal really is to find those points where we can say our larger ecosystem and we as a coalition, a decision-making body that is designed to reflect that, we have to make some choices on behalf of the community as to what we support, what we put our heft behind. And so our 15-member board, and that is a big board with 5 governors, 5 players, 2 coaches, Adam Silver and Mark Tatum and Michelle Roberts, all in the mix. The goal with that board and the work that I do with that board is to tread through all of those issues and say, what is it we actually believe? And what is fair for us to represent in the public sphere as the NBA view? And that is not a simple process. That's complicated. So you are dead on and 100% right that it is not as easy as the summary, but it does mean we end up with a product that allows us to speak clearly and say, hey, we have some very clear views on some things. And that takes a lot of work, a lot of dialogue, and a lot of conversation, which is really important.
I would say, and you can correct me if this is an unfair characterization, I would say that whatever the product of those meetings is, whatever the end result of, okay, the NBA's position will be X, or the results of the Social Justice Coalition's meeting on this issue is whatever, I would say that more often than not, or probably all the time, it's going to be reflective of what the players wanted. Because one, it is the players who, as I note, like that, not only are they the driving force of this league, but again, 75 to 80% black league. A lot of these issues, when we're talking about social justice, not exclusive to the black community in America, but obviously that is a huge priority for that particular community in the U.S. And so I would say that whatever governors are on the coalition, whichever other voices there, isn't it fair to say that, especially after what we saw in terms of player activism last year, that it's really about what the players are trying to push for. And again, they may not even be unanimous either. It's 450 players. But there is certainly was a groundswell last year surrounding specific issues, some of which you've talked about already, police reform in particular, police brutality. And so voting rights for sure. So this does feel like more of just kind of an amplification and a formalization of what the players as individuals and sometimes together were doing. Is that a fair characterization?
That's a very fair characterization. That's the driving force and the beating heart of how we got to this point. We wouldn't have a social justice coalition but for direct action by players. So the point that you're making, I think, is a really critical one that certainly I try to make whenever I talk about civil rights, social justice, criminal justice, whatever it may be. When people think about black and brown communities, I start with, the black community is not a monolith. Right? We don't believe one thing at one time. We are incredibly diverse. And the same is true of our NBA players. Like, they believe different things and they come from different places. But the point of the coalition, the point of their coming together in the wake of Jacob Blake's shooting 1 year ago in Kenosha, in the wake of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and too many other names, is to find those points of consensus and say some things unite us and bring us together and say there is a minimum standard that we want for police accountability in cases of misconduct and cases of brutality. That is pretty clear, and that gives a touch point and a touchstone for this kind of collective power. To me, that's the most exciting part of it, but you're absolutely right. There's never going to be a time or a place where we don't have to dig in and pressure test. What is it we're actually saying on behalf of the community? Does that fairly reflect what most folks feel and believe? And that to me is part of the job and feels very familiar because I spent a long time in government, as you probably know. And when you are in government, you're thinking about positions that you take on behalf of a huge apparatus. But the conversations, the meetings, the months and months, sometimes years of work that you do beforehand are to hone in on what you think is best on behalf of your agency, your administration, and the American people. The same thing is true here, that we're trying to find the point of intervention in our issue areas that is best and fairly reflect what our broad and diverse community feels and thinks.
So I think if people in any casual conversation or as a news item in the last 5, 10, 20, 30 years heard about the NBA or the NFL, Major League Baseball, some sports league is lobbying in the halls of Congress. It would have been antitrust exemptions. It would have been something about probably making sure they can still get public funding for their arenas and stadiums. It would be some fundamental business issues. Mm-hmm. It would not be social justice. This is unprecedented. It is very much emblematic of the times we live in, but this is a new area for, I think, any sports league to have decided to move into this field of issues. And I think there are probably some people out there who, in various ways, and it's not just the stick to sports crowd, but maybe even some people who sympathize on these issues might still say, yeah, but why should the NBA have a social justice coalition? What is a sports league doing lobbying Congress on police reform? I am certain that question is out there, so I'll throw it to you.
It is a question that I have heard, and doesn't surprise me at all. But the reality is that we're all part of our community and we're all part of our society. And every sports league, but especially the NBA, being in our 30 markets, having the global reach that we do, having physical plant and capital investment in so many cities, we have a vested interest in how our communities are governed. And we're made up of people who live in those communities. And that's true of all companies. And so what's interesting to me and the most exciting to me, to your point about this being something that nobody's ever done before, is to have a 501c4 organization directed towards advocacy, but it's on social justice issues, is that it really expands the frame of what's possible in the social responsibility context. And it asks the question of what is our obligation as a global multinational? What is our obligation to our communities, and how should we be involved? Is it in corporate donations? That's a good and really important thing, but is that where the water's edge stops? And the answer clearly from our players and our governors and our leadership is no. If we're going to be involved, then let's be involved. And I personally, and again, as an old political hand, appreciate pulling back the fig leaf and not pretending that we're not all engaged in politics, right? On some level, politics impacts everything, whether it's when or where you can cross the road to how we decide like who does get some of those exemptions, or what it looks like to hold people accountable who have the badge and the gun and are supposed to protect us, but oftentimes too often don't. Those questions all end in a political space. And it's a recognition of that reality that created the Social Justice Coalition, where we're going to be in that space. We're going to choose our spots. It will be new. It'll be different, and it will certainly feel and look different than certainly anything that I'm aware of. But to my mind, that's the important part, is that we're not trying to do business as usual. We're trying to change business as usual and make sure that our voices are heard in those halls of power.
I would think on some level, given the wave of athlete activism that we saw last year, obviously far beyond the NBA, it was all sports. It was all walks of life, period, for a time there. I would think that this should not necessarily be a surprise or something strange to members of Congress to have a representative of the NBA, yourself as head of the Social Justice Coalition, coming and speaking to them about these issues and lobbying them. On the other hand, again, this is kind of new. So what has been the response when you're talking to, whether it's directly to elected officials, whether it's to their staffers, others who are involved in these issues? How are they greeting your presence? And I mean, in the sense of you being representative of the NBA in particular, a group that had not necessarily been in their offices prior to this, at least on these issues.
Honestly, it's been overwhelmingly positive, which is really great. And at the end of the day, one of the major assets that we as an NBA community bring is our global brand. There are very few people who don't know what the NBA is and who wouldn't pay attention if we come out in support or against a particular issue. And that is a significant power in and of itself. And that is part of what any smart elected official will be aware of, right? That they understand that we can bring in new participants into the process, new eyeballs, and raise awareness in a way that a lot of other organizations, or they may not be able to. And so for that reason, it has been a great thing to be able to be engaged with legislators and their staffers and start to build those relationships and say, this is what we believe, and we think the work that you're doing is good. For example, being able to bring together Tim Scott, Republican of South Carolina, and Karen Bass, Democrat of California, with Steve Ballmer, Carl Anthony Towns, and Karan Butler for a conversation on policing reform that we had broadcast is just a sample of how we want to get engaged and get involved. But I haven't seen either of those incredibly powerful elected officials together talking about a pending piece of legislation on one of the most important and most fraught issues in our nation. I hadn't seen that happen before. But when you present the opportunity to raise up that dialogue and to bring in those new eyeballs by dint of having our coalition members, and Kat's on our board and Steve Ballmer's on our board, and Karan Butler has been an incredible social justice advocate, they understand that that means that that's a political power, right? That communications ability and the ability to raise awareness on an issue that we've been fighting on for, quite frankly, decades when it comes to policing reform, but now have a bill on the table that could actually move something. They understand that because they know what they're doing, they know their business. And so for that reason, they've been very receptive to those kinds of conversations. By the same token, thinking about our sentencing reform policies and criminal justice, we came out as a coalition in support of the Equal Act, which finally eliminates the disparity between crack and powder cocaine sentencing, something that's been on the books for 30 years and still hasn't been remedied. It's been cut down a few times, but that disparity, which has purely racist origins in our criminal justice policy of the 80s, is now on the table as a legislative policy that we potentially may pass. And so us supporting it and being able to engage with Kelly Armstrong from Republican of North Dakota, who is one of the principal sponsors in the House, as well as Hakeem Jeffries, a progressive Democrat in House leadership, who are both coming together around a criminal justice reform issue that has significant racial justice implications. Us standing alongside them, which we did a couple of weeks ago in public forum to say, let's actually try to move this thing, that matters. And so I think a lot of these elected officials understand that we can be a value add, which is great, but most important that people are paying attention and their constituents are paying attention to what the MBA community says. And that's really important.
So it's been, as we mentioned, a year since the Jacob Blake shooting, a year since the Wildcat strike, a year since a lot of these issues were really brought to the fore across the country and certainly by the NBA players themselves in the bubble. We have seen very recently the House passing the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which, as you mentioned earlier, a huge vested interest by the NBA and the Social Justice Coalition in that. The House has also approved the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Fate of both, as you and I speak, fate of both of those things unclear in the Senate. Two things. Give me some sense of how you went about pushing for these particular pieces of legislation on behalf of the NBA and the Social Justice Coalition. But also, I guess it's just a matter, it's just this. This feels like we're going to hit the same old roadblocks. And it's hard not to be cynical about that. Your job, of course, is to bring as much optimism to that as possible, because feeling defeatist probably doesn't do well as a lobbyist. But I do wonder if these issues are going to, after all the talk last year, after all the activism, after we all filled the streets, not just players, not just activists, but everybody. Like, this country was mobilized in a way that I have never seen in my lifetime for a time. And it feels like so much of that has faded. Is there enough momentum still there? Is there enough will in the Senate? Is there enough Republican support, frankly, that we're going to see either or both of these acts passed and then signed by President Biden?
I mean, you're really hitting on the nail on the head, Howard. And the reality is, my job is always to bring optimism, but it's also to bring realism about what it takes to move the ball forward in the political arena, because it doesn't happen overnight. We didn't just discover racism in America last year, right? Like, we didn't just discover we had a police brutality problem in America last year. It is that this is the latest phase and chapter, and frankly, a very optimistic chapter, given the large and broad multiracial coalition of people who protested last year after so many officer-involved incidents of brutality or fatalities. that's the stuff that we have to be able to capitalize on, to look in the eye and say that those moments of tragedy, those moments of pain brought us together and gave us a direction, said that we need to do something different, and gave us some political opportunity. Your question is the one that drives and animates what we do at the coalition, and anybody who's in this space and has worked in politics, is how do we sustain that momentum beyond the initial outrage? Because COVID, hopefully, who knows with Delta, but is getting to a place where we're getting to some semblance of normalcy. Folks are going back to work. Kids may be going back to school. And that dedicated time and attention that was paid to so many tragedies may not be there anymore. And that's just a reality of people working in their ordinary lives. And so how do we sustain that public attention in a way that keeps up the political pressure on our decision makers to move these bills forward? That's politics. And that's what the value add of this coalition will be, is we can continue to elevate and raise up issues in a way that others can't. But we each have to play our positions. This is like where I get into the basketball sports metaphors, because, you work at the league, that's what you got to do. But everybody has to play their position when it comes to advocacy. So some folks are going to be working hard on policy, and I spend a lot of time in that world thinking about what is actually best when it comes to crafting a policy that would hold officers accountable, that would divert the right resources to police while also supporting interventions that are non-police for situations that are emergent. That's the kind of stuff that you have to marry with, well, how do you just get people to pay attention when there's so many other things that they could be focused on, and make sure that they are pushing their elected officials to do the right thing, to vote a yay on a good bill or a nay on a bad bill. And that's really what it boils down to, is sustaining that over time and making sure we understand that the wins aren't zero sum. But to be in this position today in 2021 and having this conversation with not just the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act on the federal level, but SB2, the accountability bill in California, and the many and varied other police accountability bills that are floating their way through state houses, that is materially different than where we were in 2014 when Ferguson happened and Michael Brown was killed, right? We have made significant progress in that 7 years, but keeping that in context can be really difficult. And so our job as advocates and as people who have worked in civil rights, social justice spaces is to provide that history and say, look at that long trajectory. Let's get as much as we can and keep pushing so that we don't backslide, so that we do pass those bills, and so that we can look back and say, when it was time to look back on our part of the relay race, we did our part to move the baton forward.
Given that those two particular issues, police reform and voting rights, are so critical to what this social justice coalition was founded to accomplish, given how prominent those issues were amongst NBA players in the discussion that they were all having, that we were all having last summer, if either or both of these bills do not pass, where does that leave you? I mean, how do you? It's a setback for a lot of people. It's a setback for, I would say, for our country, to be dramatic, but it's a setback for an entire movement that a year ago we would have thought there is enough momentum across this country that these things are going to get addressed in a positive manner. It would feel, I would think, like a punch to the gut to see either or both of these fall short in the weeks to come. But that's a possibility. If that happens, I guess it's just kind of a what now? Like, where, for your purposes, your particular job and the coalition itself, is it just, okay, back to the table, find a different version that works? Is it pivot to other issues that maybe are we haven't heard coming from the coalition yet, but that are maybe a notch down from that, or maybe a little bit more, I don't want to say realistic to get past, but maybe a little easier to get past? Where do you go from there in the event that these things fall short?
Yeah, so it's a really important question. I think the easiest frame and the way I like to describe it is the reason the coalition exists and is not just an initiative of 2020 is a recognition that we have to be engaged on this year round. We have to be engaged on the issues that matter to us over the course of the long term. And that's what the investment is from the NBA community. It's the investment from folks who are in advocacy. It's a recognition that everything doesn't live and die with one legislative session. You can make incredible progress in one legislative session. You can see some really tough setbacks in one legislative session. But to win and then to retreat from the field just means that you're eventually going to see those setbacks that you're trying to prevent. So to maintain that engagement and to say whatever happens on the federal bills, we're going to keep pushing, whether it is to find an alternative bill. Right now, they're debating an alternative bill version. I think this may be the third or fourth alternative version of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, right? Taking a different approach on qualified immunity or segregating out pieces of it. Those are the standard legislative mechanisms that you use to try and move your issues forward when you can't get everything that you want. And this is part of what I think is really important for people to understand, because it can really turn people off about politics, right? Is that you have a very specific goal, and then the process, which is what it is, ends up meaning you have to pivot or divert or take 2 steps forward and 1 step back and continue moving in a way that feels incrementalist. Those are the kinds of things that we have to continue communicating about and make clear. We can win big sometimes, and sometimes we will take smaller victories. But the long term on policing isn't going to be just the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, partially because most policing isn't governed at the federal level. Most of it is actually state and local. So us getting involved, and part of what I'm really excited about at the coalition is to be able to support the work that so many people are doing across our teams in their cities and states, that individual teams have invested in advocacy for voting rights, saying that we want to promote access to the ballot. We want to make sure voter suppression doesn't happen, and we're going to come out and say so, to make sure that people who have policing accountability bills making their way through their legislatures are engaged and interested in promoting that. Those kinds of things are really important, and I think really are the bulwark against the kind of disappointments that so many people feel when they look at a federal bill and say, well, if that failed, then we have no other avenues. That's never the case. There are always other avenues, because our society is complex, is multi-layered, and governed at so many different points that we've got points of intervention on voting, on criminal justice, and policing that go beyond those bills.
So your job is by nature a political job on some level, and you served 8 years in the Obama administration in the Justice Department. So I know the political side of your background that brings you to this job with the NBA. I don't know the athletic or potentially basketball side of it. So because I'm curious, I'm always interested. What brought you generally to this job? Why this position at this time for you? And how much of it was informed by any NBA fandom or your own basketball career, wherever that topped out?
So it was informed 600% by my basketball fandom that goes back to when I was 7, 8 years old. So I grew up in the UK, and then I was born to Caribbean parents in England. And 1992, the global game, the Dream Team, that was the first introduction of basketball in a major way beyond satellite to the British population. And so back then, I saw, as a young Black boy in England, these avatars of Black excellence in the Dream Team that inspired me and just sparked that lifelong love. So my family is spread between here and the U.S. and Barbados and Guyana, where my parents are from. And so when we eventually moved to the U.S., which was a long delayed move, I was the third of a few kids who were not supposed to happen in England. So I spent my childhood there. We moved when I was 14. And so I played basketball as a kid. I played high school basketball here in Maryland, where we moved. And that's where my career topped out, the Howard Lions basketball team. But the reality of the way basketball made me feel, and the representation that I felt, the notion that representation matters before that was a phrase, really resonated throughout my life. And so I've been a diehard basketball fan since I was a kid. And the idea that one day I would be able to marry my career passions as a civil rights lawyer and social justice advocate with my basketball fandom from the time that I was a kid, like, that's not the kind of thing that you could predict, but you know it when you see it. And so it made it a no-brainer to join the community and try and help lead some of this work.
In some respects, the dream job that you could have cooked up in your own head a few years back, but that could not have ever possibly existed, suddenly exists, and you've got it.
Bingo. It sure do. You got to know what you have when you have it.
No, it's incredible fortuitous timing for you in some sense in that way. What have you learned as a basketball fan who came in from the outside with just a passion for the game, but you're not an NBA insider in terms of you didn't rise through the ranks of their army of lawyers at Olympic Tower, which is the usual path to prominent NBA executive positions. What have you learned about the league in your short time that you didn't realize? And have you had any moments, since people can be in the same room now, have you gotten that thrill as the fan who then gets to be on the inside of the first time meeting whichever player it might have been that you had that fandom attachment to?
I have had a number of thrills that were just being in arena. And I mean, I've been to maybe 7 or 8 pro games in my life while watching a lot. And that is true because I think the stat is 99% of basketball fans will never see the inside of an NBA arena. And most of the distribution is digital. To be in arena as a staff member, to be part of the community, and to have conversations with or pass by NBA legends, current players. I was at Summer League a couple of weeks ago, which was sort of this great immersive experience, especially when combined with Rookie Transition Program, where we were doing a panel on social justice, because we have the coalition, we've got the foundation, we've got this work that we're doing in that impact space and trying to introduce our rookies to the opportunities that are available to and how do we support them. It's heady stuff. And I doubt I will ever get over that piece of it, because there's nothing more exciting than the game and the sport and the community that you've loved from a distance, embracing you and bringing you in to help be a part of what we're going to do, and something that is incredibly important to me and to so many of us. So I don't think going into any arena or being in HQ in New York or meeting any of the players or the team executives or the coaches to have a conversation with Doc Rivers was really meaningful to me, because I've been a fan for such a long time. He's been such a brilliant and thoughtful voice on justice issues, to be up close and personal and walk by some of these players. And I'm 6'4", by the way, but until you see a couple of 7-footers floating by you, you then realize man, there are some serious folks out here playing this game. It's huge. And to me, that's something that I don't take for granted. And what's been most exciting is, as you probably know, there are lots of folks who've worked at the league office for decades. And to a person, every one of them says it never gets old. Yeah.
Did you have an awestruck moment? Was there any one particular player or legend that you walk in the room for the first time and go whoa, okay, I was not prepared quite for this. You got to obviously you got to keep your cool in these moments. But if you, on the inside, let's say, who was the most awestruck?
I can't, because there have been too many. If I pick one, then I'll be sliding some others. But I will say that there are that those moments are really special. And I think one of the most meaningful moments, so separate apart from several awestruck moments, was to have Dennis Scott be a moderator on a panel that I was on with Greg Taylor and Sheree Deans and Karan Butler. And to me, that was the after I watched Dennis Scott playing growing up on the Magic back in the day, right? 3D's, it's incredible. And then to have Karan, who's had this brilliant career as a player, then now as a coach and as a social justice advocate throughout his career, that really gives life to why this coalition has the potential that it does. Because there are so many players who people like me or you who are fans look up to or looked up to once upon a time and now have followed, who are putting their political capital, their celebrity, and their influence on the line in service of a mission that really matters to so many of us. And that really, that hits your heart.
I meant to ask this a few minutes ago when we were talking about your time in the administration. I don't know, does Department of Justice get invited to the Obama pickup games? Did you ever have any court time with the president?
I never did. And it's still it will be one of my lifelong regrets. So hopefully on the retirement games at some point, I'll manage to edge my way in.
Who is the most prominent person you've been on a basketball court with while in shorts, not in your career?
While in shorts?
Actually playing, yeah.
Actually playing. Nobody's special. Like
Okay.
nobody wants a broken down 39-year-old hack like elbowing them in the ribs underneath the rib.
So the Social Justice Coalition isn't playing pickup after your meetings?
Not yet, but I'm telling you, that's not a bad idea. Have had at least one internal to the league pickup game, which is great. And there are very few businesses you can be in where that feels like a very natural extension of the work.
I mean, a game of horse, at least, right?
This is what I'm saying. So I tell you what, Howard, like next time we talk, if I don't have a good story of like being on the court with somebody notable in shorts, then I'm doing it wrong.
I'm going to hold you to that. We will do this again for sure. All right. So a couple more before I let you go. This is clearly more of a policy issue and certainly more of an Adam Silver question. So I will apologize in advance, but it's germane to the discussion. The players' activism was very overt last year for obvious reasons, but that included, of course, in the bubble, the messages on the backs of their jerseys, Black Lives Matter imprinted on the courts in the bubble, a lot of PSAs that were running during those games. And this past season, 2020-21, has felt like just business as usual. No one's kneeling and linking arms before the game during the anthem. The messaging is all gone. At a glance, people might say, all right, well, everybody moved on. And I know that's literally not the case because players are still involved and I'm still hearing their voices. We're still seeing them, writing essays and speaking out and using their platform in a bit of a lesser way as the whole country has kind of moved beyond that moment in a sense. But this is how things go, right? There's a big groundswell around a particular issue or cause, and then things fade a little bit. It becomes more of a policy matter, so it does move kind of to the background, even if the work's getting done. But for the league's purposes, that was a big deal. That was a big deal that we're putting Black Lives Matter across the baseline and that players are with their coaches and the referees and with the league's consent or agreement to be kneeling during the anthem. Like, it was powerful. And for some people, it was powerful and negative. Some people, it was powerful and positive. And your audience as the NBA is going to cut across that entire spectrum. But it's not there now. And I think the cynical view would be, well, they moved on. They seized a moment, sure, but they moved on. They're not doing it. It's not as prominent. And maybe it also has something to do with that ratings dip. Again, I understand those are especially on the rating side and everything, and the political messaging of the league. That is very, very much more an Adam Silver question. But to the extent you can address that from your position heading up the coalition, what do you think about where the league is right now, both overtly and behind the scenes compared to what we saw last summer?
So, number one, it's undeniable that moment last year was incredibly powerful. It will go down as a moment in history that reshaped certainly the sports world and had a significant impact on our community and our society. That's the power of sports. That's the power of culture. That's the power. That's why we love sports, right? It's for those moments. It's the athletic prowess, but it's everything that comes along with it. It's the stories, it's the narratives, it's the human connection. So to have Black Lives Matter on the court, to have the jerseys with justice-oriented messaging was so very important to that moment. Where we are now is saying, what do we do with that moment? And that to me is the entire reason for my job. It's the reason for the coalition, for the work that we're doing, both at a higher level in raising up our issues of concern, but also supporting our teams in the way they do their social impact advocacy. Is how do you make it real? And what I am most optimistic about, and why I think it matters, and why I think it's important that we draw that linkage, is that we're always going to have the ebb and flow of the moment that captures public attention. You can trace that back to the 50s and 60s and the civil rights movement and the first use of television as a medium to really show domestically what is happening in the South in segregation and what that means. And the way that the architects of the civil rights movement used those moments to create the political space to push for really big pieces of legislation. And now we look back at it and it's kind of this sort of catechism of, oh, we had some segregation and then we had some pushing, MLK gave a speech and then we passed some laws. But that was a process of 20 to 30 years. And so to think about that, to understand what Thurgood Marshall and the Legal Defense Fund did in making cases, wend their way through every level of the courts, that married up to the grassroots activism that was happening community by community, protesting institutionalized racism, and then that manifesting in ultimately these bills being passed through the Congress and signed by the president. All of that gets distilled down. But my point in referencing that is that I think we have something similar right now, where we have these really important moments, especially now we're so hyper-connected and digitally interlinked, that we get to see what the league is doing. Folks paid attention to that. That helped fuel the fire of advocacy on the grassroots level. But most important to me, and this is always going to be my bias, again, I'm a government guy, I'm a process guy, I'm a system guy, and I want to think about lasting change that cannot be done with the stroke of a pen, is how we translate that energy, that momentum, and that incredibly powerful messaging that the league did into powerful laws and policies that reflect those same values. And that's a complicated and longstanding task. And nobody is going to want to put, legislative process ongoing on the back of a jersey, right? Like that's not what it is. It's about our values. And so that's why those pictures will go down in history. They're not going to go away. And to me, they are a touchstone of league history. They're a touchstone of American history, and they're a touchstone of social justice history. And the work that we're going to do as a coalition builds on that, and we'll continue to build on that. And the messaging that you'll see is going to be very specific. It's not just going to be about one person or a set of people who have suffered these immense tragedies that are a proxy for Black and Brown communities. It's going to be about how do we push for the reshaping of our systems of power so they're responsive to our communities. That's a very different conversation, and that's where we are in 2021. So I think it's a really important question and framing, but it's all part of that trajectory and that history that we shouldn't forget, that dates back decades to now, and it's going to look different in 2021 than it does in 2020.
That's a great answer and fair one. Appreciate the extensiveness and also the historical backdrop to that. I would also just say, as somebody who's been in media all my adult life, that another way of looking at this is simply that the reason it was so powerful to see the messaging on the court and players kneeling and linking arms and messaging on the back of the jerseys and the PSAs is because we had never seen anything like this before, ever. And it was a moment, and it was powerful because it was unusual, because it was an outlier, because it was the product of the moment that we were living in. And yeah, I could make the case like, well, if the players and everybody are so committed to this, keep the messaging on the court. But if it fades to the background, if it just becomes part of the general this is what the NBA looks like every night. There's these messages on jerseys and on the court and whatever. Maybe it changes up every so often, but it probably loses some potency if it's just part of if it becomes the norm instead of the outlier. It needed to be the outlier to pack that punch. And maybe there'll be another moment where that comes back. Let's hope it's not necessary. But I would just say, as somebody who, again, from a standpoint of media and the way that we write about these things and talk about these things, when it's new and it's unusual and it hits you in the face, that's when you're forced to grapple with it. When it becomes just part of the woodwork, literally in this case on the court, it does lose some potency. So I actually think it's all cynicism aside, and some of that cynicism may be justified. I can understand why it actually makes sense to kind of have moved on from that particular strategy. Let me get you out on this one. We know the big tentpole type issues which we've discussed, especially voting rights, police reform, and the legislation that's ongoing. What is on deck? What have we not heard about yet, or what are you excited to get moving on somewhere on the horizon here as head of the Social Justice Coalition?
Well, number one, all of those things are big. And so voting rights is going to be not just the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, but we know 400 bills were introduced into state legislatures across the country last year that had suppressive intent or effect. That's a real problem, and that's a lot of turf to fight on. But really important that we start thinking about that, because it's going to make a huge difference for our next election cycles and people's ability to cast a ballot, the most basic and most important of our rights. So that'll be a big fight. In criminal justice, one of our big priority areas is such a big bucket. Like, we started on sentencing reform, which is just one piece of the pie. There's so many elements of our mass incarceration complex that need to be unwound and dismantled. And I spent a ton of my time thinking about which parts of that can you attack from which perch and what makes sense in sequence given where we are in the movement. We'll have a lot more opportunities on the horizon to think about criminal justice. But one of the things that I think is really important is that the big issues that we've identified as a coalition are not necessarily the same as the issues that teams are taking on in their own social impact work. So thinking about whether it's food insecurity, right, or supplier diversity, or whatever it may be, there's so many different things that teams are taking on that I think are really important and of a piece with social justice, that it kind of answers the question that tends to haunt me as I think about our movements is we like to generally do one thing at a time. So we usually like to do community engagement and meeting people where they are and making sure that people are involved, but then we don't put resources behind it. Or we like to do the grant making and say, yes, we're going to give money, but we don't want to think about the political piece of the puzzle. And so to have the ability as a lead community through our various vehicles to do that community engagement and outreach, to do that grant making on various levels, and to recognize that politics touches everything, and that while things can be nonpartisan, there are very few things that are non-political in terms of decision making about how we govern ourselves as a society. Being able to touch all of those things at the same time and having that opportunity, and for our coalition board to be able to say, hey, our next set of issues could go anywhere in the justice space, is what makes this an incredibly exciting position for me.
Phenomenal. James, this has been great. Appreciate the time, appreciate all you're doing and that the Social Justice Coalition is doing. I look forward to finally meeting in person at some point here, since we are kind of all starting to get into the same buildings again and arenas. And yes, I'm expecting the next time we talk to hear about the killer game of horse you had against Karl Anthony Towns and Steve Ballmer. So see if you can arrange that. I want it filmed. I want play-by-play, all of it. That'll be our discussion next time.
Bet. It's on. I appreciate the time so much, Howard. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.